Hello, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm here today with our guest, Paul Carroll. Paul Carroll works with the Center of Charity and Security. And I got acquainted with their work when Justice for All, was helping fight CVE, countering violent extremism programs, which really target the Muslim community in Maryland, especially Montgomery County, the model was used, has been used in several different cities around the country, and has really impacted Muslims in the region especially when they're looked through entirely through a security lens. And today I had invited Paul and representatives from his organization so we could discuss a little bit how perilous it is for humanitarian work during the war on terror, during other war zones. It's very There are many charities who have been targeted by different governments, including the United States government, when they're doing this work. And so we wanted to discuss what some current events in that region of humanitarian work, and really get to know the kind of work that Paul does. So thank you so much, Paul, for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes. So our show focuses on justice work around the world, whether it's overseas, whether it's the work that we're doing on anti-genocide or Muslim minority rights, or work that other organizations are doing. And we really want to highlight the work that people are doing in very difficult spaces that perhaps might not get mainstream spotlights, but are really crucial. And so thank you so much. We're really grateful for you to be here. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? How did you get involved in this field?
Well, thank you. I'll try to be efficient because it's not a particularly compelling story, but I had spent most of my professional career in a different area of security, and am learning that the implications of that work really had caused a lot of the issues that are impeding humanitarian programs and peace building work. Let me be more specific. I spent most of the last 20 years working on nuclear nonproliferation and nuclear arms control. And so think about North Korea, think about Iran, and so on. And in that world, the idea of imposing sanctions on governments in order to cajole them or persuade them to come to the negotiating table is not often questioned, or it's seen as a necessary, although maybe blunt tool. And oh, yes, it sometimes causes harm to people you don't want it to, but you got to do it. Well, unfortunately, that's not really the case. The jury is very much out on whether sanctions actually work to do what you think you're trying to do with them. The jury is not out on the negative effects that they have on civilian populations, and for the purposes of the Charity and Security Network, on the very civil society actors, nonprofits, humanitarian groups that are trying simply to aid people that need aid, and they are cut off, blocked, basically stopped from doing so. And so when I saw what this organization was doing and they were looking for a new director, I had several reactions. One of them was, why have I not heard more about this? And that's a problem. And the second one was, I felt that I had something to contribute, that I could help raise the visibility of these issues, of these problems, and bring the experience I had had in an adjacent security arena to bear on this.
So can you tell us more about Charities and Securities Network? Is it a coalition of organizations? Is it one nonprofit who is working in different spaces?
It is truly a network. I mean, the name is accurate. It is designed to be greater than the sum of its parts. We have hundreds of members, although with any network, the number of members, you have fewer that are active and energized, but but I was very impressed to see that there are scores of organizations, both domestic in the US as well as international, from the large sort of household names like CARE and Oxfam to much smaller organizations that are very local, doing peace building, humanitarian, and human rights work. And
Mm.
so the common cause that we share is to ensure that they are allowed to do their legitimate work. You know, at the end of the day, we are truly there to protect the rights of civil society and individuals to do what they're there to do. And that we can talk more about the various ways in which that is impeded, but we have working groups that take on different topics. We share information so that everyone can understand the latest, risks, threats, conditions, and so on. So the power of a network is very much at the core of what we do.
Mm. So, does the one of the things that I wanted to ask, like for example, the Muslim community here, one of our most famous cases, the Holy Land Foundation case, that a organization that was very involved in, it was probably one of the largest charity organizations in the United States for the Muslim community, and their top brass was all taken in after post 9/11, and they have been accused of aiding and abetting terrorism because of their work in the Palestinian territories. So, how would your organization be able to help or assist someone in that position? Is that what? And then my follow-up question to that would be, what else have you seen in the field? Are the sort of struggles that organizations such as these have?
Well, you're starting off right in the deep end of the pool. You're absolutely right. One of the core projects that we take on, we call it the lawfare project. Lawfare has become a term of art where legal tools, legal tactics are used not because they're necessarily valid, but because they serve political ends. So an organization may have a political purpose or have a beef with an organization, and so they figure out a way in which filing a lawsuit, making an accusation will cause problems for the organization that simply they don't like. The Charity and Security Network does a number of things with respect to these types of lawfare actions or attacks. We are able to provide connections to organizations that can provide direct legal assistance, pro bono law services, legal representation. We can petition the government or governments that have been the recipient of such legal claims and make statements on behalf of the organizations that are targeted. In some cases, when these types of petitions or claims are made, we're able to push back, so to speak, and, for example, let the U.S. State Department know that there's no basis for these claims, and then they may consider that in whether to just dismiss the suit or so on. It's interesting because if it's a formal lawsuit that is filed, then the legal process is something that can't be ignored. In other cases, lawfare may not even be that sophisticated. It may be simply guilt by association. And you're actually, the one other thing I wanted to say is you're getting at the core underpinning of where all of this difficulty stems, which is the immediate days, weeks, and frankly, years after the 9/11 attacks. Not only did we see very rapid legal action taken in the United States with things like the Patriot Act and so on, but it was frankly sloppy. The counterterrorism rules, regulations, and laws that were promulgated were, I think, understandably in the heat of the moment and with a lot of emotion, but they're not serving anyone well. They're not only are they not serving the security interests of the United States or frankly the world, but they're doing real damage to legitimate peace building and humanitarian work. And this lawfare aspect is one of the most difficult and I would say nefarious aspects of that.
Well, for those in our audience who may not know what material support is, because sometimes when we work in these bubbles, we forget that, and as we're beaming into millions of homes in the US, we want to just make sure that people understand the definition of material support. So could you explain that for the audience?
That's a tough one because that's exactly what we run afoul of.
Mm,
And I'm being a bit facetious, but the long pole in the tent, so to speak, is the material support statute or statutes. And the phrase material support has become the center of gravity for a lot of US and frankly international counterterrorism law. And what that means is, suppose you're a humanitarian organization and there's a large population that needs food and medicine and clothing. Not that uncommon.
mhm,
You're going to deliver, you have staff there, you're going to drive trucks and buses and deliver this material. Well, suppose that area is controlled by an organization that has been designated as a terrorist organization, a
mhm,
formal designation. By virtue of simply being in that neighborhood, you could be supplying what is called material support to
mm,
a foreign terrorist organization. So that in that scenario, that's sort of the most formal and I think linear way in which organizations are understandably nervous. All
mm,
they're trying to do is aid a population in need. But depending on who controls the area where camps may be, where those populations may be, who might control a road and charge a toll, even if it's very minimal, the minute money is exchanged, that could be construed as or defined as material support. While that may seem like, well, then don't do it, the problem is that the material support phrases and clauses are so sweeping and
mm.
the clarity with which the entities, in particular the Department of Justice in the United States, has made clear to non-governmental organizations and nonprofits, it's very muddy, it's very unclear. You can't be sure whether your program will actually violate that law or
Wow.
not, or you can't be clear, even if it's technically a violation, if they're going to come after you and prosecute you. So what
Mm.
does all this at the end of the day? It means there's an incredibly strong chilling effect on civil society. There's so much uncertainty, and the risks of being prosecuted or um, given a violation under these rules and laws is so great that they simply don't do their programs, and people
Oh.
suffer.
Where have you seen this most played out? What parts of the world? Can you give us examples?
Well, I think the most recent and most compelling is in Yemen.
Mm,
Yemen has had a devastating war over the last 7 years now. And in one of the more, I would call it headline news, in one of the more Trumpian final acts of the Trump administration in the United States, literally the final day of his administration, Secretary of State Pompeo designated Ansar Allah, the
mm,
Houthis in Yemen, as a foreign terrorist organization. That is a formal implication. The Houthis in Yemen control much of the land, de facto government services, and areas where much of the population are living. So we're talking about maybe 23 million people that are in great need of food aid, clothing, medicine, and so on. Add to that the COVID pandemic, and things are just exacerbated. So suppose you're a humanitarian organization and last year you started programs, you're bringing in medicine and food, you're keeping people barely at subsistence living. Suddenly, the entire zip code, if you will, where the Houthis control Yemen, where the vast majority of these people live, is off limits
mm,
because they've been designated a foreign terrorist organization. So I was on phone calls with organizations that um, saw this coming. They were worried. There were appeals, please don't do this. It happened anyway. And then there were, I mean, imagine the machinery of these programs in motion. And at the leadership level of these organizations, they simply have to say stop. I mean, ships were off of the coast, had to be stopped. It's heartbreaking because here's a population that is in dire need. The World Health Organization has called this the most pressing humanitarian crisis in the world today. Now, if you will go a step further, the day that the designation was made, or the days after, there were also sort of permissions granted, licenses were issued. The Department of Treasury, and something called the Office of Financial Assets Control, are able to issue licenses to allow some exceptions, to allow some programs to continue. Over the last 20 years, these licenses have been the way in which many nonprofits have sought to continue their programs. But it's an incredibly complex and time-consuming effort to get these licenses.
Mm.
Our community and our organization and our network was very encouraged because those licenses about Yemen were quite broad, they were immediate, and there was a bit of a sigh of relief that people felt we can continue our programs. Now, if you talk to the lawyers, they might have said, not so sure. And so again, even as rapid and encouraging as the license issuance was, and the Biden administration statement on its first day of office saying you get a pass, a very general broad license through February 26th, it still does not ensure that there will not be criminal prosecutions or violations issued. So I sometimes use the analogy of, suppose you go to rent a car, right? And the car rental agency says, you know what, you can drive this car 90, that's fine with us, no problem at all. Okay, so that may be the State Department or the U.S. Agency for International Development saying, don't worry about it. Well, the highway patrolman may see it differently. The highway patrolman says, the limit's 60 and you just went 90, and they're going to slap the cuffs on. And so that is the world in which peace building, human rights, humanitarian organizations are living. There are criminal statutes that really ultimately hold the authority and are triggered when sanctions are imposed, when foreign terrorist designations are issued. And so the Yemen story ends well because ultimately the Biden administration completely revoked the designation. Okay, great. Unfortunately, that doesn't change the context or the conditions under which NGOs are still operating, which is this material support.
So who would be, sorry to cut you off, but who would be the highway patrol in this case, in these scenarios? Is it the Justice Department? Is it states themselves?
In the U.S. context of the material support laws, it's the Department of Justice. And over the years when clarity was sought from the Department of Justice about, can we go? Can we do this program? There was sort of a wishy-washy response. A colleague of mine likes to refer to it as the don't ask, don't tell. There's sort of a wink and a nod. We want you to continue your work, but that's not the same as either completely altering the law itself or a clear and full-throated declaration from the Department of Justice, we won't prosecute. So the material support law is really the core of the matter. Until that law is changed and clarified to allow the types of life-saving programming and peace-building work that can reduce conflict, the entire breadth of civil society is going to be operating under this sort of Damocles sword that could drop at any time.
As you said, when a small charity is working, and especially in places, some of these places, it is the smaller charities that might get there first because they have less red tape within their own organizations. What should they be doing? What would your recommendations be to them? How many of them even check who's on the terrorist list or who's been designated? And I have friends who work for some of these organizations, and I seriously doubt if that's in their job description or they're checking on that. But what would your suggestions be to them?
So I would say two things. You've hit on another matter, which is the resources needed to deal with these challenges are significant. And so even the even the risk of running afoul of these laws, of these regulations, not just in the U.S. context, but in countries where organizations operate, it's either not worth it, or organizations may not even be aware of it. What I would suggest they do is we have a website, the Charity and Security Network, charityandSecurity.org. We offer and act as a clearinghouse of information, a connector for organizations. There are excellent organizations that are based in Europe, based in the UK, based in regions in the Middle East, North Africa region, and so on, that share our mission, they share our information, and in fact, in cases where they are local groups on the ground, they are best equipped because they really know the state of play in that neighborhood. And so what we can offer, again, is legal advice, legal training, in some cases, legal representation. We can also offer advocacy to the regulators, to the governments. Now, that's easier said than done, depending on the case in which we're talking. I mean, as difficult as it is in the US context, we are talking about a government system, relatively speaking, that is transparent, that is approachable, and so on. If you're talking about a government itself, which is more authoritarian, less transparent, it's extremely difficult. And the other unfortunate repercussion of the US sort of reflex in the wake of 9/11 is that many nations followed suit, including the United Nations. The sort of waterfall of counterterrorism rules and regulations and policies that followed the 9/11 attacks permeated the entire international system.
And this is but now it's been 20 years since 9/11, and with this being impeded on so many different levels, what are the current efforts in trying to address this law? And it is called the Foreign AEFDA, from what I understand, or correct me if I'm wrong.
There's a couple, and I don't think they try to make it impenetrable by design, but it's pretty impenetrable. So there's one called the Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act, which is a criminal statute which contains material support as a phrase and a clause, which forbids a broad range of material support to foreign terrorist organizations and so on. There's also something called IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which allows presidents to issue sanctions, and then sanctions in turn can trigger restrictions on NGO activity. And so back to your question, though, yes, here we are 20 years later. There is some good news, right? On the one hand, 20 years has sort of entrenched a bureaucracy that has gotten into the habit of not allowing exemptions unless there is some active noise or knocking at the door saying, hey, we need some exemptions. The habit or the default has been, here's a sanction, here's an executive order. They don't provide much relief. And so the civil society community and or elected officials have to make a case for that. That, we believe, is changing. The Biden-Harris administration has already ordered a review of sanctions policy, which is extremely broad, but gets to the point of, why do we do these things? Are they working for us? What are the negative consequences? That's a huge opportunity for our community and humanitarian groups, peace-building groups to have their voices heard. So that's one aspect. The more specific aspect is, now that we have a relatively receptive, we hope, administration and new players in Congress, our community is actively going to support and advocate for changes to that material support law. There have been some small changes at the margins of U.S. national security law, and I would also say humanitarian aid law. There was something called the Global Fragility Act, GFA, which has endorsed and basically authorized programs to reduce conflict, reduce recidivism to conflict, if you will, provided funding, but it has stopped short of really fixing the material support problem. We are now encouraged by statements from elected officials, by some of the early statements from the Biden administration about rethinking the tools that are used, if you will, on national security and diplomacy. Now, we're also realistic. There is a lot on the plate of the new US president. We have a COVID pandemic, we have economic problems, so, a lot of these things. However, this is part and parcel of a review of what is in the interest of the United States and of the world for national security. The last thing I'll say on that is, yeah, you're right. It's been 20 years. And my experience in the national security arena is that countries often need an enemy, and this is unfortunate. It would be much better if we looked to alliances and friends, but at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union evaporated, the more establishment national security players, in a way, were relieved, but in a way, were also wringing their hands. Well, now what? Now who's the bad guy? And unfortunately, a few years after that, 9/11 happened. Guess what? Terrorists are the bad guys. And so, in a way, it's like that. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What has been caught up in that response is legitimate and life-saving humanitarian and peace-building work.
Now, I want to ask you a sort of a difficult question, because for us, it's one of our flagship projects is the Burma Task Force. And as you see right now, the country has been again taken over by a government that is genocidal. And not only, and it's a unique government in some senses, because this is the only military in the world that can fund itself. It doesn't get funding from the civilian government. It didn't get funding from the civilian administration at all, because they own the gem industry, the mining industry, so many layers. Like, you can't do business in Burma without being involved with the military. Many human rights organizations, including ours, are calling for targeted sanctions on and especially on military-owned businesses. So how does this when do sanctions work ever in your experience? We believe that they worked in Burma before they were taken away, the Jade Act specifically, and others. But I'd like to hear your position.
No, I think it's an excellent question. I'm going to do my best to answer. And one caveat is I'm not an expert on the efficacy of sanctions, but I think you've hit on a very good point. During the run up to the United States and European actors negotiating with Iran on the nuclear deal, there was this phrase, smart sanctions. I thought that's actually a good phrase. Let's be smart about this. There's also, I feel, a sort of a psychological desire to punish bad behavior, right? Sanctions, punishment, that's in many ways a human sort of proclivity. That being said, I wouldn't say no, never, ever are sanctions useful. I think the way you described the Burma situation, I could imagine a scenario where if there were entities or individuals that were identifiable and clearly defined as targets of sanctions, that they could work. Would it be absolutely 100%? No one else would be harmed? Probably not. I think the North Korea example is another interesting one. I had been working on North Korea and its nuclear program. At one point, there were sanctions levied on an entity, a banking entity called Banco Delta Asia in Macau. And in that case, I think it was almost by accident a case where sanctions worked too well, because it got the attention of the North Korean leadership. It hit them in their individual pocketbooks, and they reacted quite quickly. And did that have extra repercussions for the North Korean population? Hardly. It really was about that elite set of actors and their financial dealings. So I think that it would take people who really understood the machinery of the Burmese military, and the flows of money. And coupled with that, I would say some bolstering, if possible, of the humanitarian efforts and support for the Burmese population.
Yes, definitely. And that is so important because right now, currently, people are not able to access cash just because the military has put a hold on, none of the ATMs are functioning in the country right now. But yeah, there's a lot to be discussed there. But thank you for that insight. I did want to talk about as we talked a little bit earlier about nonprofits being targeted, especially those who operate in territories like Palestine and other places where it's often the entire movement of that country is broad with has been demonized in a lot of times in mainstream media and how can how can your organization or your network help? What are some methods that nonprofits can be protected during these times?
Well, again, I would point to the legal rights of organizations being core to what we do. In the Palestinian context, let me be clear, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, when you hear that phrase, what it means is, well, there's there's a war going on, and it exists at many different levels. There are organizations and individuals that are staunchly supportive of Israel, and that also becomes very broad, and in many cases it's more political than technical. We are very clear, I think, in our position that we support the rights of organizations to act in Palestine. We do not take positions on some of the political conflicts between Israel and Palestine, the BDS movement, and so on. What we do advocate for very strongly is the legal, legitimate rights for NGOs, nonprofit organizations to operate in Palestine. And as you say, it's fraught. Unfortunately, it's fraught, and it's in many ways all too easy to lob a complaint or an accusation at an organization operating in Palestine because of that fraught nature. But that's not something we shy away from. We immediately will stand up for the rights and the protection and the advocacy of organizations to do so. And then the last thing I will say is, again, we act as sort of connective tissue for organizations for the assistance they might need, legally speaking, and also in some cases early warning. An organization, as you say, that might be a very small one, might be the target or the recipient of a complaint or some type of a legal suit. And the sooner the rest of us are aware of that, the better. Better the chances to protect them, to advocate for them, to push back on specious claims.
So if it's not a legal claim, but suppose there's organizations that are being targeted on these very well-read blogs, investigation against terrorism, et cetera, should they contact you at that point, or does it need to get to a legal standpoint before?
No, I would say absolutely contact the Charity and Security Network. I've been in some conversations recently. The lines aren't clean. There's also issues of disinformation, misinformation. In fact, there was recently a special rapporteur from the UN who is going to be issuing a report on disinformation in the international community. And you've hit another nail on the head. I mean, this is difficult because it may not rise to the formality of a legal case, but it can do reputational damage to organizations simply to be accused or simply to be the target or victim of some type of disinformation.
Or an unindicted co-conspirator. That is a term that a lot of Muslims walk around with a badge of honor. Yes, I'm unindicted, and we're like, yes, right. We're glad you're unindicted. We wouldn't want you to be indicted. So yes, that is something definitely that I know many in our community can relate to.
And you, when you mentioned the ATMs in Burma, you reminded me of something, because that has to do with really what is often the lifeblood of day-to-day living, and certainly with respect to nonprofit organizations running programs, access to financial resources or even their own finances. And so one of the things that can come with these types of reputational attacks is that is something called de-risking.
Mm.
Banks or financial institutions can get very nervous very easily. And even though you may have had an account that you had been using to fund your work in Palestine, suddenly someone lobs an accusation, and that bank says, sorry, your account's closed, or you take your business elsewhere. This is a very real issue, a very real challenge that a large swath of nonprofit organizations are dealing with. This
Mhm.
issue of de-risking is quite broad. It's quite a challenge. And what makes it more complex is that, yes, there are government regulators and government entities with authority to manage and oversee financial institutions. Financial institutions are private business entities.
Mm.
And so on the one hand, they have rights to choose who to do business with or not. On the other hand, their default has been, that sounds messy, we're not getting near it. When what we would like them to do is learn more about the efforts that nonprofits go to make sure their financial transactions are legitimate, are clean, that they are doing their due diligence. It is quite remarkable how many, even the smaller NGOs, go to great lengths to ensure that their transactions and so on are legitimate. And often banks and sometimes even online payment platforms will shy away from that. We're trying to help educate them so that they
Oh,
will change their behavior.
yeah. We would love for anytime you put Syria on a PayPal, uh, a note that
Right.
automatically gets blocked. Your account gets blocked, even if you're an individual. I remember just locally, Syrian refugees had arrived in Maryland, and local moms group was getting together and, hey, let's buy them something. So one mom offered to go buy them the crib or whatever we were raising money for, and just okay, crib for Syrian refugee, and all these ladies' accounts were blocked because you had the word Syrian in your transaction. So, so it affects individuals and nonprofits. So I'm glad there's someone working on educating financial institutions about that, because that can definitely make life very difficult. And there's also, so this is, we've mostly focused on the US, but there are a lot of international implications as well. What are some of the broader um, difficulties that you've seen in your work, and especially in dealing with governments that might not have that much transparency?
Well, I would say there's two things. I mentioned earlier the sort of cascade of rules and regulations after 9/11, that many nations followed the United States lead. In some cases, maybe with good intent. In other cases, uh, they might have said, aha, here's a way we can even further limit civil society in our own country. I was surprised to hear that countries like the Netherlands, for example, were considering a law that would further restrict certain transactions to certain countries. And I think this is important to note, because it really depends on the swirls of politics in any given nation, whether there are extreme parties or perspectives that get elected. And then even countries you might think are fairly progressive or open and transparent, a law could occur, or change in policy. With respect to nations themselves that are already less transparent, less democratic, it's hard for me to even characterize. Um, and I think it's also hard to know how difficult organizations and programs occur in those countries. Um, Most of the international work we do, at least that I have seen so far, has been with European colleagues,
Mhm.
with Scandinavian colleagues, and in some cases with Middle East, North Africa colleagues. There is an encouraging note there, though, however, which I think can percolate down to even the smallest, maybe least transparent nation. The UN architecture around counterterrorism, and in particular financial access, is finally beginning to take up issues of nonprofit organization financial access and
Mm.
push back against the perspective that, oh, terrorists use nonprofits to launder money or to pass money.
Mm.
Just in the last 24 hours, we've heard leadership in something called the Financial Action Task Force point out that a new working group will be established to examine this problem, to
Mm.
recognize that it is a problem, that nonprofits basically have gotten a bad shake. They've
Mm.
basically been labeled as, oh, this is the way terrorists get money, when it's simply not the case. And
Okay.
therefore, let's work to change policies and procedures and work with financial institutions to say, you know what, that's not a risk. Or if you feel it's a risk, let's manage it. Let's not simply avoid it.
We have a audience question. Um, so they're asking about spending money. Could spending money be looked at as free speech? And if they use if you use this in your legal defenses?
It's a very good question, and unfortunately, and I'm not trying to sidestep it, I'm not an attorney, and I don't know for sure. However, I do know that the issue of money and transaction with money, and whether it is considered speech or not, is an active issue.
Mm.
I would, again, refer you to contact us, contact me. My colleagues who are attorneys would be better equipped to answer. But I think it's a very interesting question because I know in the U.S. domestic context there have been court cases where money is seen as speech, and in some cases, depending on the context, that can be anti-democratic. I think in a humanitarian or peace building scenario where you need money in order to, for example, host a training or access populations in need, it's an incidental and necessary transaction. I'm not really answering the question directly in a legal sense, but I would refer you to our website or contact me, and then we can put you in touch with the right people.
So before we wrap up, I did have a question about your Civicus Alliance. That was something that really just piqued my curiosity. So this is So what do you monitor, and how do nonprofits benefit from this?
Civicus and the Charity and Security Network work closely together. They do an amazing job at taking the temperature, if you will, monitoring the openness, transparency, and operating environment for civil society in nations. And obviously, there are a lot of nations in the world, but they do updates, I believe, on a monthly basis, where they take a look at, say, it might be Canada one month, it might be Venezuela the next, and it's essentially an index. What are their legal institutions looking like? What's the atmosphere for civic society or civil society? And I recommend their reports. They're really excellent. They also track things over time. So they might say, well, here's where this country was a year ago. Are the trends good? Are the trends bad? I think that I would I would characterize their reports as a hugely valuable resource for civil society. There may be an organization or an individual in country X that is curious, is this happening anywhere else in the world? And these civicus reports can offer that type of information and perspective. And if so, they can contact organizations there and say, how are you dealing with this? Is the situation similar?
Interesting. Yes, it's sad to see the U.S. turn from open to obstructed. Hopefully, we can get back to green again. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your experience and your advocacy. We hope that any leadership watching this will reach out and join the Charity and Security Network and protect yourself. I mean, this is something that is important for us to do when we don't have the resources to, in-house legal department. Not all charity organizations can afford to have one. And this is a service that Paul's organization provides. So thank you so much, Paul, for your time and your efforts. And we'd love to have you back again to, discuss the Yemen situation further.
Thank
you. Please go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity and the invitation, and please, anyone listening, don't hesitate to contact us.
Thank you. And for those of you who are watching, we are going to be continuing on with our interviews with camp survivors from the concentration camps in East Turkestan, the Uyghurs. And tonight we will have Zumrat, who is a Uyghur housewife who has been was picked up and was in the camps for over 18 months. So please join us at 7 p.m. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.